When a young man with barely enough money to feed himself raises his hand at an auction to bid on a cat no one else wants, he has no idea how this single act of kindness will change his life forever. What happens next will surprise an entire town and reveal a miracle no one could have predicted. This is the story of Lucas and Patches, a tale about seeing value where others don't, and discovering that sometimes, when you save another life, you end up saving your own. The autumn wind blew cold across the fairgrounds as people gathered for the county animal auction. Farmers in overalls stood next to families in warm jackets. They stomped their feet and rubbed their hands together to stay warm. Mr. Peterson, the auctioneer, stood on a wooden platform. His voice boomed through a microphone. Next up, we have a fine dairy cow, 3 years old, and gives plenty of milk. Hands shot up in the crowd. Numbers were called out. The Theta cow sold quickly for a good price. Behind the platform, in small cages and pens, the animals waited their turn. Chickens clucked. Goats bleated. And in the smallest cage of all, a black and white cat huddled in the corner. "That's Patches," whispered a farm boy to his friend. "My dad says he's worthless. Can't even catch mice right." Patches had one torn ear and dull, patchy fur. His green eyes were wide with fear as the cages around him emptied one by one. When only a few animals remained, Mr. Peterson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Now, folks, we have a barn cat. Name's Patches." 2 men carried the small cage to the platform. When they set it down, Patches pressed himself against the back, trying to disappear. "Starting bid is $5, Mr. Peterson announced. "Every farm needs a good mouser." The crowd went quiet. People shuffled their feet. No one raised a hand. "Come on, folks," Mr. Peterson tried again. $5, that's a bargain." A woman in the front row shook her head. "That cat looks sick," she said loudly. "Too old to be any good," a man added. "Probably wild anyway," said another. Mr. Peterson's smile faded. This happened sometimes. Not every animal found a home. "All right then," he said, reaching for his gavel. "If there are no bids, I'll mark this one as unwanted, and we'll move on to the $5. The voice came from the back of the crowd. People turned to look. A young man stood there. He couldn't have been more than 20. His jeans were worn at the knees, and his jacket had patches on the elbows. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and serious brown eyes. "Did you say $5, son?" Mr. Peterson asked, surprised. "Yes, sir." The young man nodded. $5 for the cat. A few people snickered. Mrs. Wilson, who owned the feed store, leaned over to her husband. "That's Lucas Parker. Works at the bookstore. Why on earth would he want that scraggly thing?" Mr. Peterson looked relieved. "We have $5. Do I hear 10? The crowd stayed silent, but now they were watching Lucas with curious eyes. "Going once for $5, Mr. Peterson called. "Going twice." He brought down his gavel with a crack. "Sold," to the young man in the back. Lucas walked forward through the crowd. People stepped aside, some shaking their heads, others whispering, "Behind their hands." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill. The money looked crumpled, like he'd been saving it for something important. "You know that's not a pet, right?" Mr. Peterson said quietly as he took the money. "It's a barn cat. Probably never been inside a house." Lucas just nodded. "I know what he is," he said. When they brought Patches forward in the cage, the cat hissed and backed away from Lucas's hand. "See what I mean?" Mr. Peterson shrugged. "Wild as they come." "That's okay," Lucas said, his voice gentle. "Everyone deserves a chance." He picked up the cage carefully. Inside, Patches had gone very still, green eyes wide with fear, or maybe surprise. This was new. No one had ever picked up his cage so gently before. As Lucas turned to leave, carrying the cat that no one else had wanted, he didn't see how many eyes followed him. He didn't hear the whispers. $5 for that cat? What a waste! Poor boy must be lonely or something. That cat'll run away first chance it gets. Mark my words. But Lucas didn't seem to care what anyone thought. He just held the cage steady as he walked through the fairgrounds, heading for the parking lot where his old pickup truck waited. Inside the cage, Patches watched him with cautious eyes. Something was different about this human. Something the i.e. cat couldn't quite understand yet. Lucas reached his old blue pickup truck and carefully set the cage on the passenger seat. The truck had seen better days. The paint was chipped, and one headlight was held in place with duct tape. "It's not much," Lucas said to Patches, "but it gets me where I need to go." He got in and started the engine. It came to life with a rumble and a shake. Patches pressed himself against the back of the cage, fur standing on end. "It's okay," Lucas said softly. "I know it's loud. We'll be home soon." As they drove through town, Lucas kept talking. His voice was calm and steady. "My apartment isn't very big, but there's a window that gets lots of sunshine. I think you'll like it." Patches just stared at him, ears flat against his head. "I know what it's like," Lucas continued, "when nobody wants you." He glanced at the cat, then back at the road. "I grew up in foster care. 7 different homes by the time I was 16. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. "Some were nice, some weren't. But none of them were really mine, you know." Patches had retreated to the farthest corner of the cage. His tail was wrapped tightly around his body. Lucas turned down Main Street. The shops were decorated for fall with pumpkins and colorful leaves. "We need to make a quick stop," he said, as he parked in front of Pete's Pet Supply. The bell jingled as Lucas walked in. A girl with red hair looked up from behind the counter. "Hey, Lucas, what brings you in today?" "Hi, Emma. I just got a cat." Emma's eyebrows went up. "You did? That's a surprise. You never mentioned wanting a pet." Lucas shrugged. "It wasn't exactly planned. I was at the county auction and—" "The auction?" Emma interrupted. "You got an auction cat? Those are usually farm cats, not pets. They catch mice in barns." "I know," Lucas said, "but no one else was going to take him." Emma gave him a curious look. "Can I see?" Lucas led her outside to his truck. When she peered through the cage, Patches hissed. "Wow," Emma said, stepping back. "He's really wild and kind of rough-looking." "He just needs care," Lucas replied. "And time." Back inside the store, Lucas filled a basket with supplies: cat food, a litter box, a soft bed, and some toys. At the counter, Emma rang up his items. "That'll be $47.85. Lucas pulled out his wallet. Inside was a single $50 bill. He handed it to Emma, who couldn't help noticing there was nothing else in the wallet. "Lucas," she said quietly, "was this your grocery money for the week?" He just smiled. "Everyone deserves a chance at a better life." "Emma," she handed him his change and added a small bag of cat treats. "On the house," she said. "Good luck with your auction cat." When Lucas returned to his truck, Patches was sitting up in the cage, watching the people pass by on the sidewalk. "Almost home," Lucas promised as they started driving again. They passed the town library, the hardware store, and finally stopped in front of Turning Pages, the small bookstore where Lucas worked. Above the store was a narrow set of stairs leading to his apartment. Carefully balancing the cage and the bag of supplies, Lucas climbed the stairs. The autumn wind had grown colder, and he could feel Patches shivering inside the cage. "We're here," he said, unlocking his door. "Welcome home, Patches." The apartment was small but neat. Books were stacked everywhere, on shelves, on the coffee table, beside the single bed in the corner. A window overlooked Main Street, with a wide sill where the afternoon sun created a warm spot. Lucas set the cage down and opened its door. "You can come out whenever you're ready," he said. "No rush." Patches didn't move. His green eyes watched Lucas's every movement. Lucas set up the litter box in the bathroom and put food and water in 2 bowls in the kitchen. He placed the soft cat bed on the sunny windowsill. "This can be your spot," he told Patches. "Best view in town." As the sun began to set, Lucas turned on a lamp and sat in his armchair with a book. He didn't try to touch Patches or force him out of the cage. He just read quietly, occasionally glancing over. The cat remained frozen, watching and waiting. But somewhere in those cautious green eyes, there was a glimmer of something new. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, a tiny spark of hope. The first night was quiet. Lucas left the cage door open but didn't try to coax Patches out. Instead, he went about his evening routine. He made a simple dinner of soup and crackers, washed his dishes, and took a shower. Before going to bed, Lucas set his alarm clock and arranged his work clothes for the morning. Patches watched everything from inside the cage. "Good night, Patches," Lucas said softly. "Sleep well." When Lucas turned off the lights, the apartment became dark except for the glow of streetlights through the window. For a long time, Patches didn't move. The strange sounds of the apartment building were nothing like the barn where he had lived before. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock, the occasional footsteps from another apartment. All of it was new and frightening. Hours passed. Finally, when the apartment had been quiet for a long time, Patches crept to the edge of the cage. He sniffed the air cautiously. His whiskers twitched. Slowly, one paw at a time, he stepped out. The floor felt strange under his paws, smooth and cool. Patches froze at every creak and shadow. His ears swiveled, listening for danger. But the only sound was the steady breathing of the human asleep in the bed. Patches crept along the wall until he reached the food bowl. The smell made his empty stomach rumble. He hadn't eaten all day. Quickly, he gulped down some food, then darted back to the safety of the cage. When morning came, Lucas woke to find the cage still occupied, but the food bowl half empty. He smiled. "Baby steps," he said to Patches. "That's okay." Lucas got ready for work, moving slowly so as not to startle the cat. Before leaving, he refreshed the water bowl and made sure the apartment was safe for exploration. "I'll be just downstairs if you need anything," he told Patches. "Mrs. Chen is expecting me at 8 o'clock sharp." The bookstore below the apartment, Turning Pages, was owned by Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had run it for 40 years. The bell jingled as Lucas entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen." The small woman looked up from her cup of tea. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes were sharp behind round glasses. "You're 3 minutes late, Lucas," she said, but her voice was kind. "Sorry, I was saying goodbye to my new cat." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows shot up. "A cat? Since when do you have a cat?" "Since yesterday. I got him at the county auction." Mrs. Chen frowned. "An auction cat? Those are working animals, not pets." "I know, but—" Lucas started. "No one wanted him?" Mrs. Chen finished for him. Lucas nodded. They were going to mark him as unwanted. The old woman's expression softened. Ah, Lucas, always trying to save the world, one lost soul at a time. She patted his arm. What is this cat's name? Patches. And where is Patches now? In my apartment, still hiding in his cage, mostly. Mrs. Chen nodded wisely. Auction cats are wild. They don't become pets. He just needs time, Lucas insisted. Perhaps. Mrs. Chen handed him a stack of books. These need shelving. New fiction section. Lucas spent the day working in the bookstore. He helped customers find books, organized the children's section, and updated the inventory. Every few hours, he would sneak upstairs to check on Patches. Each time, the cat was still in his cage, green eyes watching Lucas warily. By closing time, Lucas's shoulders drooped with fatigue. As he was counting the register, a cough bubbled up from his chest. He covered his mouth, but couldn't stop the harsh barking sounds. Mrs. Chen appeared with a glass of water. "That cough is getting worse," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "It's nothing," Lucas insisted after he caught his breath. "Just a cold." Mrs. Chen didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Upstairs, Lucas made a simple dinner and settled into his armchair with a book. This time, he read aloud. "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," he began. "Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort." His voice filled the small apartment as he continued, reading. From inside the cage, Patches watched and listened. Something about the gentle rise and fall of Lucas's voice seemed to calm the cat's fears, if only a little. That night, another coughing fit woke Lucas at midnight. He stumbled to the bathroom and fumbled in the medicine cabinet. His hand closed around a prescription bottle. He shook out a pill and swallowed it with tap water. The label on the bottle read, "Parker Lucas. Take 1 tablet as needed for symptoms. Follow up with Dr. Richards in 30 days to assess treatment options." Lucas splashed water on his face and looked at his reflection in the mirror. His skin was pale and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He sighed heavily. "One day at a time," he whispered to himself. When he returned to bed, something made him pause. The cage was empty. Patches was under the couch, just a pair of glowing green eyes in the darkness. Lucas smiled. "Good night, Patches," he said softly. "Welcome home." Under the couch, Patches blinked slowly. This place was strange and new. This human was strange and new. But for the first time in his life, no one was yelling at him or chasing him away. For now, that was enough. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Each morning, Lucas would wake up, get ready for work, and speak softly to Patches before leaving. Each evening, he would return, make dinner, and read aloud from his favorite books. Patches was still hiding most of the time, but the cat had claimed new territory, moving from under the couch to behind the bookshelf, then to the space beneath the small kitchen table. On the 4th day, Lucas discovered something by accident. He had turned on his old radio, a gift from one of his foster families years ago. Classical music filled the apartment, violins and pianos playing a gentle melody. To Lucas's surprise, Patches emerged from his hiding spot. The cat sat in the open, ears perked forward, listening to the music. "You like Mozart?" Lucas asked with a smile. Patches didn't run away. He just blinked slowly, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. For almost 10 minutes, he stayed there, listening. When the music changed to a news report, he disappeared under the couch again. After that, Lucas played classical music every evening. Sometimes Patches would appear, sometimes not. But it became part of their routine. A week after the auction, Lucas woke up feeling especially tired. His chest ached, and his cough seemed worse. But he got ready for work anyway. As he was tying his shoes, another coughing fit hit him. This one was bad, making him double over until he could catch his breath. When he finally looked up, Patches was watching him from across the room. The cat's eyes were wide and alert, his body tense. It was the closest Patches had come to Lucas while he was awake. "I'm okay, buddy," Lucas wheezed. "Just a cough." At the bookstore, Mrs. Chen took one look at Lucas and frowned. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "Like you haven't slept in days." "I'm fine," Lucas insisted, but his voice was raspy, and his hands shook slightly as he arranged books on a display table. At lunchtime, Mrs. Chen disappeared upstairs to her own apartment above the back of the store. She returned with a container of soup. "Eat," she ordered, handing it to Lucas. "My grandmother's recipe. Good for healing." The soup was delicious. Warm broth with ginger, chicken, and vegetables. Lucas felt better after eating it, but by closing time, he was exhausted. "Go home early," Mrs. Chen said. "I can finish the inventory count. But no arguments. Rest. That's an order from your boss." Lucas smiled weakly and headed upstairs. In his apartment, he kicked off his shoes and fell onto the bed. Too tired to even change his clothes. He was asleep within minutes. He didn't know how long he'd been sleeping when he felt something unusual. A small, warm weight near his feet. Lucas opened his eyes just a sliver. The room was dark except for the glow of the street lamp outside. At the foot of his bed, curled into a perfect circle, was Patches. Lucas's heart leaped, but he stayed perfectly still. This was the first time Patches had come this close voluntarily. He didn't want to scare the cat away. Pretending to be asleep, Lucas listened to the soft purr that rumbled from Patches. It was barely audible, but it was definitely there. The next morning, Patches was gone from the bed, back to his hiding spot. But something had changed. A barrier had been crossed. When Lucas called in sick to work that day, his voice was so hoarse that Mrs. Chen didn't argue. "I'm bringing you soup," she declared over the phone, "and medicine." An hour later, she knocked on his apartment door. Lucas wrapped himself in a blanket and shuffled to let her in. Mrs. Chen carried a large bag that smelled wonderful. But she stopped short when she entered the apartment. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. Patches was sitting on the windowsill, not hiding, just watching. The cat's fur was cleaner now, and he didn't look quite as skinny. His green eyes followed Mrs. Chen cautiously, but he didn't run away. "Your wild auction cat doesn't look so wild anymore," Mrs. Chen said as she unpacked containers of soup and tea. "He's still nervous," Lucas said, his voice scratchy. "But he's trying." Mrs. Chen studied both Lucas and the cat for a moment. "Maybe you two broken souls are fixing each other." She made Lucas sit at the table and eat the soup while she tidied up the apartment. All the while, Patches stayed on the windowsill watching. Before leaving, Mrs. Chen set a small paper bag on the counter. "Medicine from my doctor," she said. "He owed me a favor. Take it every 4 hours." Lucas opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "You can pay me back by getting better," she said firmly. "That cat needs you." After she left, Lucas took the medicine and crawled back into bed. To his amazement, Patches jumped onto the bed too. The cat kept his distance, staying at the very edge, but he was there. "Thanks for keeping me company," Lucas whispered. That night, He woke to find Patches had moved closer, now curled up against his side. The cat's warmth was comforting, and his soft purr seemed to ease the ache in Lucas's chest. For both of them, these small steps toward trust felt like giant leaps. Neither was alone anymore, and somehow, that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Patches changed. His dull fur became shinier, and his skinny frame filled out. The torn ear would always be ragged, but it gave him character. Most importantly, his eyes no longer held that frightened, wild look. Lucas changed, too. He smiled more. Even when his cough bothered him, having Patches nearby seemed to brighten his mood. Word about the boy with the auction cat spread through town. It started with Emma from the pet store telling her cousin about the strange young man who'd spent his last money on a wild cat. Then, Mrs. Chen mentioned it to her regular customers, defending Lucas when they raised their eyebrows. "He sees value where others don't," she would say firmly. "A good quality in a person." Not everyone agreed. Some people thought Lucas was foolish. "Waste of money," Mr. Wilson from the feed store would say. "That cat won't ever be worth anything." One Tuesday morning, the bell above the bookstore door jingled. Lucas looked up from the counter to see Brad Thompson walk in. Brad was the mayor's son, tall, confident, and always dressed in expensive clothes. He rarely came into the bookstore. "Can I help you find something?" Lucas asked politely. Brad looked around the store with a bored expression. "My English teacher is making us read some old book. Mockingbird something." "To Kill a Mockingbird," Lucas supplied. "It's a classic. I can show you where it is." As Lucas led Brad to the classics section, Brad said, "Hey, I heard you bought some mangy cat at the auction. That true?" Lucas kept his face neutral. "His name is Patches. My dad says only crazy people treat strays like they're special," Brad said with a laugh. "Said you could have bought a purebred kitten for what you'll spend on vet bills." Lucas took a book from the shelf and handed it to Brad. "Here's your book. Anything else you need?" Brad seemed disappointed that Lucas didn't react to his teasing. "No, that's it." He took the book to the counter, where Mrs. Chen rang him up. "Tell your father I said hello," Mrs. Chen said as she handed Brad his change. "And remind him that sometimes the things others throw away turn out to be the most valuable of all." Brad looked confused, but took his book and left. That evening, as Lucas sat reading with Patches curled in his lap, he had an idea. He grabbed his phone and took a picture of Patches. The cat was barely recognizable from the scared creature at the auction. His green eyes were bright, and he looked directly at the camera. Lucas created a new social media account and posted the photo with the caption, "Patches the Auction Cat, Day 24, from unwanted to family." He didn't expect much response, but by morning, the post had 30 likes and several comments. What a transformation. "I was at that auction. Can't believe it's the same cat. More pics, please." Encouraged, Lucas began posting daily updates about Patches. He shared photos of the cat playing with toys, sitting in the window and sleeping on Lucas's books. He told the story of how no one had wanted Patches at the auction. Within 2 weeks, the account had over 200 followers. People from town recognized Lucas on the street and asked about Patches. "Your cat is famous," Mrs. Chen declared, showing Lucas that even she was following the account on her phone. One evening, Lucas received a message through the account. It was from Dr. Martinez, the local veterinarian. "I've been following Patches' story and would love to give him a free checkup. It's amazing what you've done for him." Lucas was touched by the offer. He made an appointment for Saturday morning. The vet's office was busy when they arrived. Lucas carried Patches in a proper cat carrier, a gift from one of his online followers. Several people in the waiting room recognized them. "It's the auction cat," a little girl exclaimed. "He's so pretty now." Dr. Martinez was a kind woman with a gentle touch. She examined Patches thoroughly. "He's in excellent health," she told Lucas, "and much younger than most people probably thought at the auction. I'd guess about 2 years old. He was just malnourished and scared." She scratched Patches behind the ears, and to Lucas's surprise, the cat leaned into her touch. "He's not afraid of people anymore," Dr. Martinez observed. "That's remarkable for a former feral cat. You must have incredible patience." "He just needed someone to believe in him," Lucas said simply. As they were finishing up, Lucas had another coughing fit. He turned away, trying to hide it, but Dr. Martinez noticed. "That's a nasty cough," she said, with professional concern. "How long have you had it?" "A while," Lucas admitted. "It comes and goes." "You should get that checked out," she said, her eyes serious. "Persistent coughs can indicate underlying problems." Lucas nodded, but didn't meet her gaze. "I know what it is," he said quietly. "I have a chronic lung condition. The treatment is expensive. I'm saving up for it." Dr. Martinez's expression changed to understanding. "And that's why people thought you were foolish to spend money on an auction cat." "People can think what they want," Lucas said, gathering Patches into his carrier. "It was worth every penny." Back at the apartment, Lucas updated the social media account with news of Patches's clean bill of health. The post quickly gathered likes and supportive comments. What Lucas didn't post about was how Patches had started acting differently around him whenever a coughing fit was coming. The cat would become alert, staring at Lucas intently minutes before the coughing began. It was almost as if Patches could sense when Lucas's breathing was about to get worse. "You're a special cat, aren't you?" Lucas whispered, as Patches pressed against his side one evening. Even if no one at that auction could see it. Patches blinked slowly in response, the cat equivalent of a kiss. For a cat that no one had wanted, he had turned out to be extraordinary in ways no one could have imagined. A few days after the vet visit, Dr. Martinez called Lucas. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said. "I have a colleague at Riverside Hospital who specializes in lung conditions. Would you consider seeing him?" Lucas hesitated. "I appreciate that, Dr. Martinez, but specialists are expensive." "He owes me a favor," she replied. "He'd see you as a professional courtesy to me. No charge for the consultation." Lucas thought about it. His condition wasn't getting better on its own. "Okay," he agreed finally. "Thank you." The appointment was set for the following week. In the meantime, life continued as usual. Lucas worked at the bookstore, posted updates about Patches, and tried to ignore his worsening cough. One morning, Mrs. Chen confronted him in the stockroom. "Lucas Parker," she said sternly, "you're keeping secrets." Lucas looked up from the box of books he was unpacking. "What do you mean? Dr. Martinez came in yesterday. She mentioned your appointment with the lung specialist." Mrs. Chen crossed her arms. "Why didn't you tell me your condition was serious?" Lucas sighed. "I didn't want to worry you." "Too late for that." Her expression softened. "How long have you known?" "Since I was 18, Lucas admitted. "Right after I aged out of foster care. The doctors said I need a special treatment, but my insurance doesn't cover much of it. So that's why you've been saving every penny." Lucas nodded. "I'm almost halfway there." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "And then you spent money on that cat." "I don't regret it," Lucas said firmly. "I know you don't." Mrs. Chen patted his shoulder. "That's what makes you special, Lucas." At home, Patches had become incredibly attentive to Lucas's condition. The cat would pace and meow insistently before Lucas's coughing fits, as if trying to warn him. Once the coughing started, Patches would press against Lucas's side until it passed. Lucas mentioned this behavior in his social media posts, and his followers found it fascinating. Cats are so intuitive. He knows you saved him, and now he's watching over you. Animals can sense things humans can't. The day before his specialist appointment, Lucas was working alone in the bookstore. Mrs. Chen had a dentist appointment, so he was handling both the counter and the shelving. As he climbed a stepladder to reach the top shelf, Patches' behavior from that morning kept bothering him. The cat had been more agitated than usual, following Lucas around the apartment and meowing loudly. Halfway up the ladder, Lucas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Then came a cough. But this one was different, more violent. His lungs seemed to seize, and he couldn't catch his breath between coughs. The room began to spin. Lucas gripped the ladder, but his hands were weak. The last thing he remembered was falling, books tumbling around him as the darkness closed in. Upstairs in the apartment, Patches had been restless all day. The cat paced back and forth by the door, meowing. When Mrs. Chen returned and opened the store, Patches darted between her legs. "What in the world?" Mrs. Chen exclaimed. As the cat raced into the bookstore, Patches ran straight to the back shelves, where he found Lucas unconscious on the floor. The cat began knocking books off shelves, creating a loud commotion. Mrs. Chen followed the noise. When she saw Lucas, she gasped and rushed to his side. "Lucas, can you hear me?" His lips had a bluish tint, and his breathing was shallow and raspy. Mrs. Chen grabbed the store phone and dialed 911. "We need an ambulance at Turning Page's bookstore on Main Street," she said urgently. "My employee has collapsed. He has a lung condition." While they waited, Patches refused to leave Lucas's side. The cat sat next to him, occasionally pawing gently at his arm. The paramedics arrived within minutes. As they loaded Lucas onto a stretcher, one of them noticed Patches' protective behavior. "That's one concerned cat," he remarked. "This is Patches," Mrs. Chen explained. "The auction cat everyone's been talking about." The paramedics' eyebrows rose in recognition. "My wife follows their account. Wait till I tell her I met the famous Patches." At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to stabilize Lucas. When he finally regained consciousness, a doctor with gray hair and kind eyes was standing by his bed. "Mr. Parker, I'm Dr. Sanderson, the pulmonologist who was scheduled to see you tomorrow. Seems you decided to meet me a day early?" Lucas tried to speak, but his throat hurt too much. "Don't try to talk yet," Dr. Sanderson advised. "You had a severe bronchial spasm that led to respiratory distress. If your boss hadn't found you when she did, this could have been much worse." When Lucas was able to speak later, he asked about Patches. "Mrs. Chen took him home with her," a nurse explained. "She said she'd care for him until you're better." Dr. Sanderson returned with test results. His expression was serious. "Your condition has progressed further than I'd like to see. The good news is that the treatment I would recommend has an excellent success rate. The bad news is that we can't wait much longer." Lucas nodded. He knew what that meant. The treatment would cost more than he had saved. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "Given the severity of today's episode, I'd say we need to start within 2 weeks," Dr. Sanderson replied. "I'll have my office check what your insurance covers and what financial assistance might be available." That night, alone in his hospital room, Lucas faced the truth he'd been avoiding. He needed the treatment now, not months from now when he'd saved enough. Yet he couldn't bear the thought of going into debt that might take years to repay. Years where he'd have to give up simple joys like buying treats for Patches. Patches. The cat that no one had wanted had somehow become the most important thing in Lucas's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd saved the cat, and now he was the one who needed saving. Lucas closed his eyes, exhausted. Whatever happened, he knew. One thing for certain, he didn't regret his decision at the auction. Not for a single moment. 3 days passed in the hospital. The doctors ran more tests and adjusted Lucas's medications. His breathing improved, but Dr. Sanderson remained firm about starting the full treatment soon. Mrs. Chen visited every afternoon, bringing books and news from the store. "Everyone is asking about you," she told him. "I've had more customers this week than usual, all wanting to know how you're doing." On the 3rd day, she arrived with a surprise. She opened her large purse, and a familiar face peeked out. "Patches!" Lucas exclaimed. His voice was still raspy, but his face lit up. "I know pets aren't allowed," Mrs. Chen whispered, looking around to make sure no nurses were nearby. "But he hasn't eaten properly since you've been gone. He misses you." She placed Patches on the bed. The cat immediately curled up against Lucas's side, purring so loudly that Mrs. Chen worried someone would hear. "Just 10 minutes, she promised, checking her watch. "Then I'll take him home again." But even those 10 minutes made a difference. Lucas felt his spirits lift as he stroked Patches' soft fur. The cat seemed equally comforted, kneading the hospital blanket with his paws. When Mrs. Chen reluctantly returned Patches to her purse, she had news to share. "Your cat social media account has gained many followers," she said. "People noticed you haven't posted in days. Some asked if something was wrong." Lucas hadn't thought about the account since his collapse. "I should update them, I guess." "I took the liberty," Mrs. Chen admitted, showing him her phone. "I posted that you were in the hospital. I hope that was okay." Lucas read the post. "Hello, Patches' friends. This is Mrs. Chen, Lucas's boss. Lucas is in the hospital with a lung condition he's had for some time. Patches is staying with me until Lucas recovers. Please keep them both in your thoughts." The post had hundreds of comments. Oh no, sending good wishes to Lucas. "Get well soon. Patches needs you. Is there anything we can do to help?" Lucas was touched by the outpouring of support from strangers who had been following his and Patches' journey. That evening, a nurse came in with a tablet. "You have a video call," she said with a smile. A Mrs. Chen set it up, said you might want to see someone. On the screen was Mrs. Chen's living room, and sitting on her coffee table was Patches. The cat heard Lucas's voice and came right up to the camera, nose twitching. "Hey, buddy," Lucas said softly. "I miss you." Patches meowed in response, pawing at the screen. "He's not the only one who misses you," Mrs. Chen said, turning the camera to show her living room full of people. Emma from the pet shop, Dr. Martinez, and several regular customers from the bookstore. "We all wanted to check on you," Emma explained, "and to tell you something important." Dr. Martinez stepped forward. "Lucas, when Mrs. Chen posted about your condition, people started asking questions. We learned why you've been saving every penny." Lucas felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd never wanted anyone to know about his financial struggles. "The thing is," Emma continued, "everyone remembers how you spent your last dollar on a cat no one wanted. It touched a lot of hearts, more than you realized." Mrs. Chen turned the IP camera to show her dining table, covered with handmade posters. "We're organizing a fundraiser for your medical treatment. The whole town is getting involved." Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But why would everyone do that for me?" "Because kindness deserves kindness in return," Dr. Martinez said simply. The next morning, Lucas was surprised to receive another visitor, Brad Thompson, the mayor's son. The boy looked uncomfortable in the hospital room, shifting from foot to foot. "My dad said I should bring you this," Brad said, handing Lucas a fruit basket. "It's from the mayor's office." "Thank you," Lucas said, genuinely surprised. Brad hesitated, then blurted out, "I'm sorry for what I said about your cat, about it being a waste of money." "It's okay," Lucas assured him. "No, it's not." Brad looked down at his expensive sneakers. "I didn't know you were sick, that you needed the money for treatment." "Most people didn't know," Lucas said. "I didn't want them to." "Well, I'm helping with the fundraiser," Brad declared. "I've put up posters in every store on Main Street. My dad's letting us use the community center for free on Saturday." After Brad left, Lucas struggled to process what was happening. The town that had once whispered about the boy with the auction cat was now rallying around him. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen smuggled Patches in for another short visit. This time, she brought Lucas's phone so he could update the social media account himself. Lucas posted a simple message with a photo of Patches curled up on his hospital bed. "Thank you for all your kind messages. I'll be okay with time and treatment. Patches says hi from our secret hospital visit. Don't tell the nurses." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments and messages poured in from both locals and followers from other towns who had been touched by Patches' story. By Saturday, the day of the fundraiser, Lucas was allowed to leave the hospital for a few hours. Mrs. Chen drove him to the community center, with Patches riding in his carrier. Nothing could have prepared Lucas for what awaited him. The community center was packed with people. Tables lined the walls with baked goods for sale. A band played in one corner. Children ran around with face paint designed to look like cats. And everywhere were photos of Patches, from the first day when he was skinny and scared, to recent images of him playing and lounging in the sun. Their story had been printed on posters and banners. Brad ran up to greet them at the door. "You're here! Great! We've already raised over $2,000 and people are still coming." Lucas couldn't speak, his throat tight with emotion. This was more than he had ever expected. More than he had believed possible. As he made his way through the crowd, people stopped to wish him well. Some he knew, many he didn't. They all knew him, though. They all knew Patches. In that moment, Lucas understood something powerful. By saving one unwanted cat, he had revealed the heart of his community. A heart that was bigger and more generous than anyone had realized. And as Patches sat calmly in his carrier, watching the crowd with those intelligent green eyes, it seemed almost as if the cat had known all along that this was exactly how things were meant to be. The fundraiser was a greater success than anyone had imagined. By the end of the day, the community had raised nearly enough money for Lucas's full treatment. When news of their efforts spread to neighboring towns, more donations arrived. 2 weeks later, Lucas began his treatment at Riverside Hospital. The doctors were optimistic. With proper care, his condition could be managed, and his lungs would grow stronger over time. During his hospital stays, Lucas received cards and letters from people he'd never met, people who had been touched by his and Patches' story. Mrs. Chen set up a special shelf in the bookstore to display them all. Patches became something of a local celebrity. Children would come to the bookstore window just to catch a glimpse of him sitting on the windowsill. The mayor even suggested making Patches the unofficial town mascot. Brad Thompson, once the first to mock Lucas for buying an auction cat, became a regular visitor at the bookstore. He would bring treats for Patches and new books for Lucas to read during his recovery. "My dad says sometimes the best things in life are the ones nobody else sees value in," Brad told Lucas one afternoon. "He says you taught the whole town that lesson." 3 months after the fundraiser, Lucas was back at work full-time. His breathing had improved dramatically, and his coughing fits were rare. Dr. Sanderson was pleased with his progress. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," the doctor advised during a checkup. "Your recovery has been remarkable." What Lucas was doing wasn't complicated. He took his medication, followed his treatment plan, and spent quiet evenings at home with Patches. The cat never left his side during recovery, always alert to any change in Lucas's breathing. One rainy evening, Dr. Martinez stopped by the bookstore just before closing time. She had something important to discuss. "I've been consulting with colleagues about Patches's behavior," she explained, as they sat in the reading corner. "The way he warned you before your attacks, how he alerted Mrs. Chen when you collapsed. It's quite extraordinary." "He's a special cat," Lucas agreed, watching Patches groom himself on a nearby chair. "It's more than that," Dr. Martinez said, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's a growing field of study about animals that can detect medical conditions. Some dogs can be trained to alert before seizures or diabetic episodes, but it's rare in cats, especially untrained ones." She showed Lucas articles on her tablet about medical alert animals. "Patches may have a natural ability to detect chemical changes in your body before an attack. It's unusual, but documented. So when he was acting strange before my worst attack, he was trying to warn you," Dr. Martinez finished. "And when he created that commotion to get Mrs. Chen's attention, he may have saved your life." Lucas looked at Patches with new understanding. The cat that no one had wanted at the auction had turned out to be extraordinary in the most unexpected way. "I thought I was saving him," Lucas said softly. "You did," Dr. Martinez smiled, "and in return, he saved you." As spring turned to summer, Lucas's life settled into a new rhythm. His health continued to improve. The bookstore thrived, with more customers than ever stopping by to see the famous auction cat. Lucas never forgot what the community had done for him. To give back, he started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. Patches came too, sitting regally in his carrier, as Lucas helped care for unwanted animals. "Every creature deserves a chance," Lucas would tell people who came looking to adopt. "Sometimes the ones that seem the least promising turn out to be the most special." At the next county auction, something remarkable happened. When the auctioneer presented the barn cats and strays, not a single one went without a bid. People remembered Patches's story. They remembered how an unwanted cat had changed their town. 1 year after Lucas had raised his hand to bid on a cat no one wanted, he sat on his apartment windowsill with Patches beside him. Together, they watched the sunset over Main Street. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Lucas said, scratching Patches behind his torn ear. "When I was growing up in foster care, I had a cat named Whiskers. He was my best friend. When I was 8, we got separated when I moved to a new home." Patches blinked slowly, listening. "I promised myself that if I ever saw an animal nobody wanted, I would save it," Lucas continued. "I never imagined how much that animal would save me in return." Patches purred and pressed his head against Lucas's hand. Outside, the town continued its evening bustle. Inside, in the quiet apartment above the bookstore, a young man and his extraordinary cat had found what everyone seeks: a place to belong, and someone who sees your true worth, even when no one else does. And that, as anyone in town would tell you, was the real miracle. That was the end of this heartwarming story of Lucas and Patches. Where are you listening from today? If you enjoyed this touching tale about an unwanted cat and the young man who saw his true value, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more such interesting stories. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to spread kindness and awareness. Small acts of compassion can create ripple effects that change lives, just as we saw with Lucas and Patches. Thank you for listening.